Welcome to the podcast series on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in humanitarian settings. I am your host, Liloba Paul, UNHCR Senior Learning Development Officer on topics related to gender-based violence. This work is brought to you by the Safe from the Start project, a collaboration between UNHCR's Division of International Protection and the Global Learning and Development Center in Budapest. Our topic today is camp coordination and camp management. It is my pleasure to have with me Metehan Temurcin, GBV Officer based in UNHCR's headquarters in Geneva. Welcome, Mete.
Thank you very much, Liloba. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Could you share with us a bit about your experience with mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in your activities as a GBV officer, working with colleagues in camp management and camp coordination, and also, maybe there's some crossover with other areas too.
As you mentioned, I work as a GBV officer with Global Shelter and Global CCCM Camp Coordination Camp Management Clusters based in Geneva. And at the global level, my main role is to provide technical support and advice and guidance to the country clusters. When I say country clusters for CCCM, we are talking about 22 different operations, of which 13 operations are established official clusters, and 8 of them are actually cluster-like settings. So in this context, you can imagine we are covering a variety of very different contexts. We have conflict, we have natural disasters, and now we're also seeing that sort of displacement caused by economic shocks. So in these very different contexts, my role is to work with country clusters to understand their needs, but also have to make sure that GBV risk mitigation as part of protection mainstreaming is integrated into their day-to-day work from beginning, from planning to implementation, to monitoring and evaluation, and to the closure throughout the humanitarian programming cycle. So that involves, of course, a variety of activities, such as implementing or providing CCCM-specific capacity building activities on how our colleagues in the field can actually mitigate risks of gender-based violence through camp coordination and camp management, providing them technical guidance notes, of course, in consultation with the country clusters. This could be preparing HNOs and HRPs, how to develop project proposals, and also how to sort of showcase some of the good examples in these country clusters, because colleagues in the field are doing incredible job and they are being very innovative, and since they are in the field. So my role is also to highlight these good practices which could benefit other contexts. Even the context could be different, but it could help them in terms of the ideas. So I'm playing a bit of like a facilitator role between these different operations and making sure that GBV risk mitigation is on the agenda. And finally, camp coordination, camp management covers the most vulnerable populations who are living in camps or camp-like settings. Sometimes this is an old government building, sometimes this is an abandoned semi-built infrastructure, sometimes it's just makeshift shelter or tent. And in these locations, our colleagues are trying to provide multi-sectoral service provision to the most vulnerable populations. And I think GBV risk mitigation is a really good point of entry for us as CCCM practitioners to make sure that our interventions are safe and they're inclusive and they mitigate all potential GBV risks.
Thank you. And you already started to talk about some different contexts here. So let's talk about CCCM and GBV risk mitigation in these different contexts. This could be refugee, IDP, mixed situations, but also CCCM or site management in urban settings. So what were some of the challenges you faced and how did you overcome them?
Of course, each context brings its own reality. But as you know, UNHCR addresses the GBV in 3 different ways. The one is, of course, the prevention of GBV. The second one is risk mitigation. And then the third one is the response, GBV response. And of course, the GBV response is conducted by the GBV specialists who are trained in this area. But as CCCM practitioners, I think we have a crucial role to play in the risk mitigation and prevention part. Even though the contexts are different and they have different needs, but I think some of the responses that could be provided by CCCM experts can be used in other contexts. One of the challenges that I face in last 9 months is actually sometimes GBV risk mitigation has been seen as an additional sort of additional layer of programming, or it's been seen as sort of a separate thing. Whereas actually GBV risk mitigation is the core of our programming, and it actually provides a quality programming. It doesn't create additional services or additional activities. Actually, it's within the CCCM activities. To give you an example, when you plan a site, you have sphere standards or camp management standards. You have certain amount of distance between the tents or between the shelters, or you plan certain amount of latrines per population of the camp. And these are all CCCM standards. But these are also actually contributing factors to mitigate GBV risks, or doing site maintenance activities is a core component of CCCM. And site maintenance and caring activities such as lighting or creating safe environment for women and children are also, a big GBV risk mitigation activities. So I think one of the challenges is that some of the activities that are already being conducted by the partners or the colleagues are not actually seen as a key contributor to the GBV. And end of the day, it all contributes to quality programming. I think this is sometimes forgotten due to the multiple competing tasks that are happening at the same time. So I would specifically highlight that actually what we do already contributes. It's important to highlight that, and it's also we have to make sure that we cover the specific needs of the most vulnerable, especially diverse group of women and girls.
Yes, that makes sense. And you also talked about creating safe environments for women and girls. And a key part of GBV risk mitigation is women and girls' participation in camp management structures and involvement in activities. Do you have an example of a promising practice you carried out?
Definitely. One of the key core sort of CCCM activity all around the globe is ensuring that community engagement and participation is there. As CCCM practitioners, we set up community governance structures because end of the day, first of all, the people are the first respondents to their own problems, but also they know what's best for their own needs. So we always make sure that there are, representative community governance structures in place in CCCM settings, whether it's a camp or camp-like setting. So of course, with that, we have to make sure as CCCM practitioners that the communities are represented. So you have, not only certain group of the communities represented there, but you have to make sure the women and girls, the elderly, female-headed households, people with disability are also included there. This is a very important aspect of camp management standards. So on that note, we really encourage and empower the women and girls to be part of these communities. I could give you an example. The colleagues, for example, in Yemen, are sort of putting that on the agenda to make sure that community representative groups includes the women and girls, and also their specific needs are also catered into the programming aspect of it. Another example I would actually highlight is from Yemen. As you know, the years of ongoing civil conflict in Yemen caused displacement of thousands of people, in fact millions of people across the country, and you have a really sort of intense, protracted displacement in the country. And the CCCM cluster in Yemen has done a great work with their partners where they actually interviewed the beneficiaries, especially women and girls, and they see that the lighting was one of the key issues. Especially it created a safety concern for women and children who lives in these IDP displacement sites, which are in the remote locations, and they're quite dark and they don't have access to electricity. And one of the areas that was highlighted as a specific need by the women and girls was the lighting at night to access the wash facilities, and also lighting to access the cooking facilities, which is usually a common area. So we work with them very closely to support them, and very basic intervention like provision of solar lighting in the IDP sites, to especially targeting female-headed households or areas where there is high concentration of women and girls, was one of the sort of key aims of this project, where they procured solar lamp and provided to the people with specific needs. And again, this highlights how very sort of basic interventions like this could make big difference in terms of addressing the GBV risk mitigation in IDP sites. I know also colleagues in Afghanistan. I was in Afghanistan recently for a surge mission to activate CCCM working group there, and they recently did their sort of planning for 2022, and 5 of the projects that CCCM partners are going to implement have strong component on inclusion of women and girls into the community governance structures. And this could also, of course, if inclusion of women and girls to the community governance structures also requires empowerment aspect. You may not just only expect them to be active, but you also have to create enabling environment for them to make sure that our governance structures are, inclusive of their sort of needs, but also cultural realities as well. Whether you do separate sort of community governance meetings, you just have to create a comfortable environment where they can express their views freely. So those 2 examples I would highlight from my recent experience.
Thank you. And what are some suggestions or advice that you would want to share with other members of CCCM and site management workforce on localization and involvement of women-led organizations in your work?
First of all, I think the key message I would give is that GBV risk mitigation is everyone's responsibility. It's cross-cutting. All sectors have responsibility to make sure that their interventions mitigate GBV risks and protection risks in general. That's the key message that I would share. Secondly is we have to make sure that we do no harm, not creating any harm through our humanitarian programming, and GBV risk mitigation strongly contributes to good programming, quality programming. One thing that is forgotten, Lelo, is usually we have to work with GBV experts. Each country have usually a protection and GBV experts. We have to make sure that as CCCM practitioners, we work very closely with GBV experts, colleagues from GBV AR or protection cluster. They are there to provide their expertise, but we have to make sure that the safety, dignity, non-discrimination, meaningful access, accountability and participation and empowerment should be always catered into our planning from beginning to an end. And of course, working with the local organizations and making sure that they're part of the sort of the solution is also crucial. But my basic line is CCCM is a good point of entry for most programming, since the most vulnerable populations living in the camp and camp-like settings, and GBV risk mitigation should be always on top of an agenda. So these will be some of the key messages that I would share.
Thank you. I have one last question for you. What are some resources you'd recommend to other CCCM personnel that you find useful for mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation?
I personally think there are a variety of lots of very valuable resources. Some of them are general on GBV risk mitigation, but some of them are CCCM specific. So the first one, of course, I would recommend is the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on GBV risk mitigation. There is a CCCM specific one. It's a great tool. It has really good resources and it goes into different chapters. So I would definitely recommend that. There is, of course, the how to support survivors of GBV when GBV actors is not available in your area. The guidelines, that's also very good. There is the minimum standards for CCCM as well as the camp management toolkits. These can be all accessed in the CCCM cluster's website. One important sort of resource is the safety audits. I think safety audits are crucial for CCCM practitioners, especially if you work in the camp and camp-like settings. There are different safety audits. I would recommend all CCCM practitioners to look into them, discuss about conducting safety audits with the GBV experts in your specific area. That's very important, because these safety audits are actually give us the good sort of picture of what needs to happen to create a safe and inclusive environment for women and girls, and also elderly, people with disability, and other sort of vulnerable groups.
Thank you, Mete, for taking the time to share your experiences with us on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation and for recommending some resources in the area of camp coordination and camp management.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, and to all of our listeners, do tune in to the next podcast in our series from the GLDC on mainstreaming GBV risk mitigation in humanitarian settings.